Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a kitchen that smelled like vanilla and burnt sugar, and a little bit of hope, because tonight we're talking about how Betty Crocker took over every 1950s American kitchen. Thank you so much to the viewer who suggested this one. You always find the topics that make me want to sit down with a cup of coffee and just disappear into research for hours, and this was one of those. It means more than you know that you take the time to write in, and it genuinely shapes where this channel goes next. If you have not already, the channel is also live on Spotify now, so if you would rather listen with your eyes closed, there is a link down in the description for that. Go ahead and get yourself settled in, dim the lights if you have not already, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background, pull the blanket up. We're going to be here a while, and there is nowhere else you need to be. What did a kitchen actually smell like on a Tuesday morning in 1955? What was it like to open a box and trust completely that the cake inside would turn out exactly the way the picture promised? What did it feel like to have a companion in the kitchen who was not a person at all, but a friendly painted face on a box, always smiling, always reassuring you that you were doing just fine? And just like that, it is 1954. The oven is warming, someone has already measured out the flour. And on the counter, a box with a woman's kind painted face is waiting to be opened. You knew her face before you knew her story. She was there on the box, on the pamphlet tucked into your mother's recipe drawer, on the radio when the announcer read her name like she was a trusted neighbour calling from down the street. Betty Crocker did not exist. Not as a single woman who ever stood in a real kitchen, but somehow that never seemed to matter. She felt real in the way a good memory feels real, warm around the edges, dependable, always exactly where you left her. You could not have told anyone the year she was supposedly born, or the town she supposedly came from, and yet if someone had asked you to describe her voice, you probably could have done it without pausing. That is the strange, quiet magic of the whole thing. A face painted onto cardboard, repeated across 1,000,000 kitchens, somehow became more familiar than some of the neighbours down the street. Think about what it meant to grow up with a name like that woven into the background of ordinary life. It was there in the cookbook propped open against the sugar canister, flour dust settling into its spine. It was there in the pamphlet that came folded inside a new box of biscuit mix, offering suggestions for supper you had not thought to try. It was there, softly, in the pages of a magazine advertisement your mother might have clipped and tucked into a drawer, meaning to try the recipe someday, maybe next week, maybe for company. She was not loud, she was not flashy, she simply persisted, quietly present in the corners of domestic life, the way a familiar smell persists in a house long after the cooking is done. There is something almost tender in how deliberately she was built to feel approachable rather than aspirational. She was not modelled after a movie star or a glamorous socialite. She was modelled after an idea, the idea of a capable, warm, unhurried woman who had somehow mastered the kitchen without ever seeming superior about it. Her tone, whether on the radio or later in print, avoided anything that might make a nervous young bride feel small. She explained rather than lectured. She reassured rather than impressed. In a decade that could be quite unforgiving toward women who did not already know how to keep a home, that warmth mattered more than most people realized at the time. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of it too. An entire company built a woman from nothing, gave her a name selected for its friendliness, gave her a face redrawn again and again to keep pace with the decades, and somehow that fabricated woman became more consistent, more reliable, more present in some households than an actual person might have been. Mothers were busy. Fathers worked long hours. Grandmothers lived states away. But Betty Crocker was always there, on the shelf, in the drawer, on the dial of the radio at the appointed hour, offering the same patient tone regardless of what kind of day you are having. For a young housewife newly arrived in her own kitchen, perhaps newly married, perhaps still uncertain of herself in this role she'd been handed, that consistency was its own kind of comfort. She did not need to call her mother long distance to ask how long to bake a pound cake. She did not need to feel embarrassed asking a neighbour a question that might seem too basic. The answer was already there, printed clearly, waiting patiently on a page that never judged her for needing it. In a strange way, Betty Crocker filled a gap that might otherwise have gone unfilled, standing in for the kind of guidance that used to pass slowly from mother to daughter, back when families lived closer together and kitchens were shared more often. And there is something quietly moving about how many women, decades later, still speak of her with genuine fondness, the way you might speak of an old family friend rather than a marketing invention. They remember the smell of her recipes baking on a Sunday afternoon. They remember the specific illustration on the box, the one from their childhood rather than the redesigned version that came later. They remember the cookbook itself, stained and dog-eared, more than they remember any single dish inside it. It is the kind of fondness that is harder to manufacture today, in a world of constantly shifting brands and rotating spokespeople. Back then, permanence itself was part of the comfort. She never changed too quickly. She never disappeared for a season and returned unrecognizable. She simply aged alongside the household she served, gently, patiently, the way an old friend might. And so, before the story moves into boardrooms and marketing meetings and the mechanics of how she truly came to be, it feels only right to sit for a moment with what she represented before any of that mattered. Not a strategy, not a brand, just a familiar face on a familiar box, waiting quietly in the kitchen, ready to help however she was needed. Long before she smiled from a cake mix box, Betty Crocker was born out of a company boardroom, stitched together from a surname chosen for its warmth and a first name picked simply because it sounded friendly, approachable, like someone you could trust with your Sunday dinner. There was no midwife, no birth certificate, only a team of executives deciding quite deliberately what kind of woman America needed to hear from. It is easy, looking back, to imagine this process as cold or calculating, but the truth was gentler than that. The men and women involved were not trying to deceive anyone so much as trying to solve a very real, very human problem. How do you offer help to a stranger in a way that does not embarrass her? The surname came first, borrowed from a retiring company director, a man whose own name carried a certain old-fashioned sturdiness. It sounded like someone's grandfather, dependable and unhurried. The first name came next, chosen for its softness, its friendliness, the way it rolled easily off the tongue during a radio broadcast. Names, it turns out, carry entire personalities before a single word is spoken, and the team understood this instinctively, testing variations quietly among themselves until one simply felt right. Once the name existed, the signature came next, an actual handwritten script created by a company secretary, chosen from among several submissions because it looked warm rather than official. That signature would go on to appear on millions of products over the following decades, unchanged in spirit even as the woman's painted portrait evolved again and again around it. It became, in its own quiet way, one of the most recognized handwriting styles in the country, more familiar to some households than the signature of their own mayor or governor. There was apparently considerable internal debate over small details that seem almost comically minor in hindsight, whether the signature should slant slightly forward or stand upright, whether the loop on a particular letter looked too formal or not formal enough. These decisions were treated with real seriousness, because the people making them understood correctly that a housewife studying a box in a grocery aisle would absorb these small visual cues without ever consciously noticing them, forming an impression of trustworthiness or coldness before she had even read a single word of the actual product description. What is easy to forget, sitting comfortably decades later, is how new this idea truly was at the time. Companies had advertised products before, certainly, but rarely had one invented an entire fictional personality meant to feel like a genuine relationship. It was not simply selling flour or cake mix. It was offering companionship, guidance, a kind of ongoing conversation between a company and the women who trusted it. The team understood that a housewife alone in her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon was not simply looking for a recipe. She was looking, in some small way, for reassurance that she was doing this whole, complicated, unpaid, unglamorous job correctly. And so, meeting by meeting, draft by draft, the character took shape, not as a spontaneous inspiration, but as a slow, careful construction, built the way a house is built, board by board, until it was sturdy enough to stand on its own. By the time she first appeared publicly, she felt less like an invention and more like someone who had simply always existed, waiting patiently for the world to catch up and meet her. Internal memos from this period, preserved now mostly as historical curiosities, reveal a surprising level of thoughtfulness applied to what might seem, from the outside, like a fairly simple task of naming a mascot. Executives debated tone with the same seriousness they might have applied to a major financial decision, understanding correctly that this particular decision would shape the company's relationship with its customers for decades rather than months. There was a recognition, rarely stated outright but clearly present in how carefully the process unfolded, that trust of this kind, once damaged by a false note or an inauthentic gesture, would be nearly impossible to fully repair. Even the paper stock chosen for early packaging received this same level of scrutiny, tested for how it aged on a pantry shelf over months, whether the ink held its colour under the fluorescent lighting increasingly common in the era's newer grocery stores. Nothing about the character's presentation was left to chance, every element quietly reinforcing the same underlying promise of dependability that the name itself had been chosen to convey. There is a particular kind of care in this that deserves to be honoured rather than dismissed as mere marketing cleverness. The men in that boardroom were, in their own limited way, trying to understand what women actually needed to hear, and trying, however imperfectly, to build something that could offer it consistently day after day, without complaint or judgment. That intention, whatever its commercial motives, produced something that outlived its original purpose, and became, quietly, a fixture of American domestic memory, one that would go on to outlast nearly every one of the executives who had first sat around that table debating the shape of a single letter, in a signature none of them could have known would still be recognized generations later. Long before she smiled from a cake mix box, Betty Crocker was born out of a company boardroom, stitched together from a surname chosen for its warmth, and a first name picked simply because it sounded friendly, approachable, like someone you could trust with your Sunday dinner. There was no midwife, no birth certificate, only a team of executives deciding quite deliberately what kind of woman America needed to hear from. It is easy looking back to imagine this process as cold or calculating, but the truth was gentler than that. The men and women involved were not trying to deceive anyone so much as trying to solve a very real, very human problem. How do you offer help to a stranger in a way that does not embarrass her? The surname came first, borrowed from a retiring company director, a man whose own name carried a certain old-fashioned sturdiness. It sounded like someone's grandfather, dependable and unhurried. The first name came next, chosen for its softness, its friendliness, the way it rolled easily off the tongue during a radio broadcast. Names, it turns out, carry entire personalities before a single word is spoken, and the team understood this instinctively, testing variations quietly among themselves until one simply felt right. Once the name existed, the signature came next, an actual handwritten script created by a company secretary, chosen from among several submissions because it looked warm rather than official. That signature would go on to appear on millions of products over the following decades, unchanged in spirit even as the woman's painted portrait evolved again and again around it. It became, in its own quiet way, one of the most recognised handwriting styles in the country, more familiar to some households than the signature of their own mayor or governor. What is easy to forget, sitting comfortably decades later, is how new this idea truly was at the time. Companies had advertised products before, certainly, but rarely had one invented an entire fictional personality meant to feel like a genuine relationship. It was not simply selling flour or cake mix. It was offering companionship, guidance, a kind of ongoing conversation between a company and the women who trusted it. The team understood that a housewife alone in her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon was not simply looking for a recipe. She was looking, in some small way, for reassurance that she was doing this whole, complicated, unpaid, unglamorous job correctly. And so, meeting by meeting, draft by draft, the character took shape, not as a spontaneous inspiration, but as a slow, careful construction, built the way a house is built, board by board, until it was sturdy enough to stand on its own. By the time she first appeared publicly, she felt less like an invention, and more like someone who had simply always existed, waiting patiently for the world to catch up and meet her. There is a particular kind of care in this that deserves to be honoured rather than dismissed as mere marketing cleverness. The men in that boardroom were, in their own limited way, trying to understand what women actually needed to hear, and trying, however imperfectly, to build something that could offer it consistently, day after day, without complaint or judgment. That intention, whatever its commercial motives, produced something that outlived its original purpose, and became, quietly, a fixture of American domestic memory. There is also something worth noticing in how carefully the committee avoided the obvious shortcuts available to them. They could have simply hired a well-known actress to represent the brand, someone with an established face and an established following. Instead, they chose to build someone from nothing, precisely because a known face would have carried its own history, its own associations, its own inevitable imperfections that a real woman cannot help but carry into public life. A manufactured character, by contrast, could be shaped entirely around what the company believed a trusted kitchen companion ought to be, unburdened by scandal, by aging in unpredictable ways, by any of the ordinary complications that come with representing a brand through an actual living person. This decision required a certain long view that many companies of the era did not yet practice, an understanding that a character built slowly and carefully, tested repeatedly against real audience reaction, would ultimately prove more durable than any single celebrity endorsement, however popular in the moment. Celebrities faded, retired, occasionally embarrassed the brands attached to their names. A carefully constructed fictional woman, updated gently rather than replaced entirely, could continue indefinitely, adjusting her appearance and her tone as the decades required, without ever needing to step aside for someone younger or more fashionable. The committee meetings themselves, by surviving company accounts, involved considerable debate over seemingly small details. Whether her tone should lean more formal or more folksy, whether her recipes should emphasize thrift or abundance, whether she should ever offer opinions beyond the kitchen itself, on fashion, perhaps, or homemaking more broadly. Each of these decisions was made deliberately, weighed against what research suggested actual women wanted from this kind of relationship, rather than what might simply seem clever or memorable to the executives themselves. By the time all of these small decisions had accumulated into a finished character, what emerged was something considerably more thoughtful than a simple marketing gimmick. It was closer to a carefully engineered form of trust, built piece by piece, the way a recipe itself is built, one measured ingredient at a time, until something whole and dependable finally takes shape. Before television brought her face into your living room, Betty Crocker arrived through the radio, her voice warm and unhurried, offering tips on baking and canning and stretching a small budget into a full dinner table. Women wrote to her by the thousands, addressing their letters like she was a trusted aunt, never suspecting that behind that voice were teams of home economists answering on her behalf. The radio broadcasts aired at the same time each week, a small, steady appointment in an otherwise unpredictable day, and many women arranged their kitchen chores specifically around it, finishing the breakfast dishes just in time to catch the opening notes of the program's familiar theme. The voice itself was chosen with the same care as the name had been, warm without being syrupy, confident without being cold. It spoke slowly enough that a woman could jot down measurements while listening, and it repeated key instructions gently, the way a patient teacher might repeat a lesson for a student still finding her footing. There was no condescension in it, no suggestion that a listener should already know these things. Every recipe was explained as though for the very first time, regardless of how many times it might have aired before. For rural households especially, where neighbours might live miles apart and a trip to town was not a daily occurrence, that radio voice served a purpose beyond simple recipe instruction. It was company. It filled a kitchen with sound during long, quiet mornings, offering a kind of companionship that asked nothing in return except attention. Many women later recalled listening while nursing infants, while shelling peas, while waiting for bread to rise, the voice a steady presence threading through otherwise solitary hours. The letters that arrived afterward tell their own quiet story. Women wrote asking about substitutions for rationed ingredients during difficult years, about how to stretch a small amount of meat across a large family, about what to do when a cake fell in the centre for the third time that month, and whoever answered, whichever home economist sat down at whichever desk that week, wrote back in the same warm, familiar tone the radio had already established, careful never to break the illusion that a single, patient woman sat somewhere fielding every question personally. It is worth remembering that this was, in many ways, one of the earliest examples of a brand building genuine intimacy with its audience, decades before such language existed to describe it. The company understood correctly that trust was not built through advertisements alone, but through consistency, patience, and the simple willingness to answer a stranger's question without judgment. That understanding, more than any single recipe, was what made the whole enterprise endure. The technical production of these broadcasts required its own particular discipline, scripts written well in advance and reviewed carefully for tone, timing rehearsed so that a recipe's instructions landed clearly without ever feeling rushed against the constraints of the programme's fixed time slot. The actress delivering these broadcasts, whoever she happened to be during a given era, trained specifically to sound unhurried even when the actual studio clock was ticking down toward the programme's end. Since nothing would have undermined the character's carefully built warmth faster than a voice that suddenly sounded anxious or clipped, sponsors too played their part in shaping these broadcasts, their products woven naturally into the recipes themselves, rather than announced through separate jarring advertisements. A recipe for a simple pound cake might casually mention a particular brand of flour or a particular type of pan, integrated so smoothly into the instruction itself that many listeners likely never registered it as advertising at all, simply absorbing it as part of the recipe's natural instruction. For the women writing in with their questions, there was often a particular vulnerability in putting pen to paper at all, admitting in writing that a basic task had gone wrong, that a family recipe passed down imperfectly had left her uncertain how to proceed. The company's replies, warm and specific, rarely if ever included even the gentlest hint of judgment, understanding correctly that the courage it had taken to write in at all deserved nothing but patient, genuine help in return. Decades on, some of these letters and their careful replies survive in company archives, a quiet record of an entire generation's private uncertainties and small triumphs in the kitchen, each one answered faithfully by a voice that millions of women trusted completely, never once suspecting how many different hands had actually helped craft that same steady, reassuring tone. Her face was never fixed. Over the decades, artists quietly redrew her, softening her hairstyle, adjusting her collar, aging her gently or making her younger depending on what the moment called for. She was reinvented again and again, always familiar, never quite the same twice. A face designed to keep pace with the changing American woman staring back at her from the kitchen counter. Each new portrait was the product of careful research, commissioned specifically to reflect how the average homemaker actually looked and felt at that particular moment in the country's history, rather than some fixed, unchanging ideal. The earliest portraits carried a slightly severe formal quality, appropriate to an era when women's magazines still favoured a certain reserved elegance. As the decades passed, the face softened, the expression warmed, the posture relaxed into something closer to approachable rather than authoritative. By the 1950s, the portrait in circulation carried a gentle, encouraging smile, hair styled in the soft waves common to the era, a woman who looked as though she might genuinely enjoy a conversation over the back fence, rather than simply issuing instructions from a package. What is remarkable, looking back at the sequence of portraits side by side, is how carefully each version tracked the broader cultural mood. During the difficult years of economic hardship, her expression carried a certain steady resilience. During the post-war years of new appliances and modern kitchens, she took on a brighter, more optimistic quality, reflecting a country eager to move forward. The company understood, whether through careful study or simple instinct, that a static image would eventually feel outdated, while a face that quietly evolved alongside its audience would continue to feel like someone worth listening to. There is something almost poignant in imagining the women who sat for these composite portraits, models whose individual features were blended together to create someone who belonged to everyone and no one in particular. She was never meant to be any specific woman, but rather an amalgamation, a face pulled together from many faces so that any woman looking at the box might see, in some small way, a flicker of herself reflected back. By the time she reached the version most associated with the 1950s kitchen, she'd already been reimagined 7 times before, each revision quiet, each transition seamless enough that most households never noticed the shift happening at all. She simply seemed to age gracefully alongside them, a companion who somehow never grew old in any uncomfortable way, only gently, steadily, familiar. The process behind each redesign involved considerably more research than a casual observer might assume. Artists working from actual photographs of typical American women gathered from various regions, blending features carefully so that no single ethnicity or regional look dominated the final result too strongly. The company understood, at least implicitly, that a face perceived as too specific to one particular type of woman risked feeling exclusionary to everyone else, and so each portrait aimed instead for a kind of gentle universality, familiar enough to feel like someone you already knew, general enough that a woman anywhere in the country could see something of herself reflected back. Consumer testing played its own quiet role in these decisions as well. Early sketches shown to small groups of women before a final version was ever approved for wide release. Feedback that a particular version looked too severe, too old-fashioned, too distant from how women actually saw themselves at that moment would send artists back to their sketches, adjusting a hairline here, softening an expression there, until the reaction shifted from polite tolerance to genuine warmth. This iterative, careful process meant that each new portrait, however subtle its differences from the one before, represented a genuine attempt to stay current with an evolving audience, rather than simply refreshing the packaging for its own sake. It was less about keeping the brand looking modern, and more about ensuring the character continued to feel like someone a woman might actually want standing beside her in the kitchen, whatever decade she happened to be living through. When her cookbook first landed on shelves, it did something few books ever manage. It became a fixture, not just read once and shelved, but opened weekly, stained with batter, dog-eared at the corners. For many young brides in the 1950s, it was the first cookbook they owned, a wedding gift as common as a set of towels, and just as essential to starting a home. It arrived in a red gingham binding that would become instantly recognisable, tucked into wedding gift baskets alongside mixing bowls and linens, as though the two were simply understood to belong together. Inside, the recipes were organised with a clarity that felt almost revolutionary for the time, arranged not by fussy culinary category, but by the practical rhythms of an actual week. There were sections for quick weeknight suppers and sections for more elaborate Sunday dinners, sections devoted to canning in late summer, and sections for holiday baking come winter. Every recipe assumed no prior experience, walking a nervous new cook through each step with the same patient tone the radio broadcasts had already made familiar. For many households, that single book quietly replaced generations of oral kitchen tradition, the kind of knowledge that used to pass slowly from mother to daughter over years spent cooking side by side. Not every young bride in the 1950s had grown up in a kitchen learning at her mother's elbow. Some had grown up during wartime shortages, others had simply never been taught, and for these women especially, the cookbook became something closer to a mentor than a mere reference. The book's success was staggering by any measure, selling in numbers that rivaled or exceeded some of the era's most popular novels, an astonishing feat for what was, on its surface, simply a manual for boiling potatoes and roasting a chicken. But it offered something more than recipes. It offered permission, a quiet reassurance that competence in the kitchen could be learned rather than simply inherited, that a woman without generations of guidance behind her could still produce a meal worth being proud of. Copies of that same cookbook still surface today in second-hand shops and family attics, spines cracked, pages splattered with decades-old batter, favourite recipes circled in pencil by hands long since passed on. It remains even now less an artefact of clever marketing and more a genuine piece of family history, carried forward the way a beloved photograph might be, quietly treasured long after its original purpose has faded into something gentler, something closer to memory. The physical design of the book itself deserves its own quiet appreciation, the binding engineered specifically to lie flat when propped open against a counter, an unglamorous but genuinely useful detail that spared countless women the frustration of a cookbook constantly snapping shut mid-recipe. Pages were coated to resist splatter, at least somewhat, though decades of use eventually left their marks regardless. A testament less to any packaging failure and more to simply how often these books were actually opened and relied upon. The illustrations scattered throughout the text carried their own careful intention as well. Simple line drawings demonstrating proper technique, how to fold egg whites correctly, how to test a cake for doneness, visual aids that assumed a reader might need to see emotion clearly rather than simply read a description of it. This attention to genuine usability, rather than purely decorative photography, reflected the same underlying philosophy that shaped every other aspect of the brand: substance over spectacle, genuine helpfulness over mere visual appeal. For libraries and schools during this era, the cookbook occasionally found its way onto shelves as well, used informally as a teaching reference even outside the home economics classroom. Its clear, methodical approach considered a reliable standard against which other, less carefully written cookbooks of the era were sometimes measured. For a generation of women who had not been taught to cook by their own mothers, perhaps because of the war, perhaps because of distance, Betty Crocker's precise, patient instructions became a kind of quiet education. Recipes were written slowly, deliberately, assuming no prior knowledge, treating every woman opening the book as someone worth teaching properly. There was no assumption that a reader already understood what it meant to cream butter and sugar together, or how to tell when oil in a skillet had reached the right temperature. Every term was explained, every step accounted for, nothing left to guesswork. This mattered more than it might seem at first glance. So many young women in this era found themselves running a household with surprisingly little formal preparation for it. Home economics classes existed in some schools, certainly, but they varied wildly in quality and availability, and plenty of young brides arrived at their first kitchen with only a vague sense of what a proper meal was supposed to look like. Into that gap stepped a patient, printed voice, willing to explain, without judgment, exactly how long to simmer a stew or how to know when bread dough had risen enough. There is a particular kind of vulnerability in not knowing how to do something everyone around you seems to assume you already know. A new bride serving her first dinner to in-laws, uncertain whether the roast was properly done, uncertain whether her biscuits should have risen higher, carried a private anxiety that rarely gets mentioned in histories of the era, but was very much present at countless kitchen tables. Having a reliable, patient source of instruction, one that never made her feel foolish for asking, eased some portion of that private worry. Many women later described working through that cookbook almost systematically in their first year of marriage, trying one recipe after another, gradually building confidence the way anyone builds a new skill, through repetition and small successes. A pot roast that finally came out right, a pie crust that did not crumble apart. Each small victory, guided by those same patient instructions, became a quiet source of pride, evidence that competence really could be learned, rather than simply possessed from birth. By the time these women had children of their own, many had internalized enough of the lessons to teach their own daughters directly. The oral tradition quietly restoring itself a generation later, built on a foundation that had, ironically, been laid by a fictional woman and a very real team of careful, patient home economists working behind the scenes. This particular style of instruction represented a genuine departure from many earlier cookbooks, which had often been written by and for women who already possessed considerable kitchen experience, assuming a baseline of knowledge that left newer cooks feeling excluded before they had even begun. Older cookbooks might simply instruct a reader to cook until done, trusting an experienced eye to interpret what that meant. Betty Crocker's instructions, by contrast, specified exact times, exact temperatures, exact visual cues, treating the absence of prior knowledge not as a failing, but as simply the honest starting point most readers actually occupied. This approach required a particular kind of institutional humility from the home economists writing these instructions, a willingness to explain even seemingly obvious steps without any hint of condescension, understanding that what felt obvious to an experienced cook was often genuinely unclear to someone standing at her own stove for the very first time. It would have been easy, and perhaps even tempting, to write with a slightly more sophisticated tone, assuming at least some baseline competence. Instead, every recipe erred consistently toward patience, toward explanation, toward meeting the reader exactly where she actually stood. The cumulative effect of this approach, repeated across thousands of recipes and multiplied across millions of households, was a genuine, measurable shift in kitchen competence across an entire generation. Women who might otherwise have struggled for years to develop basic cooking skills, instead building genuine confidence within their very first year of marriage, guided patiently by a voice that never once suggested she should already know better. When the very first cake mix arrived on shelves, it promised something radical, a homemade cake without the guesswork. But early sales were oddly disappointing, and researchers eventually discovered why. Women felt uneasy about a mix that required only water, as though the ease of it made the cake feel less like their own. The solution was almost absurdly simple, and it would change baking forever. Company researchers, genuinely puzzled by the lukewarm reception to what seemed like an obviously convenient product, began conducting interviews with actual homemakers, trying to understand the resistance. What they uncovered was something subtler than simple skepticism about taste or quality. It was a quiet, largely unspoken discomfort with feeling replaced. Baking a cake, even a simple one, carried a certain pride of ownership, a sense that the final result belonged to the woman who had made it. A mix that required only the addition of water felt to many of these women uncomfortably close to admitting that any of the actual work had been removed from the process, leaving behind something that felt manufactured rather than homemade. This was a delicate psychological puzzle, and the company's response to it revealed a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of human nature for the era. Rather than simplifying the process further, the solution moved in the opposite direction, deliberately reintroducing a small amount of labour back into the recipe. It seems, on its surface, like a strange choice for a company trying to sell convenience, and yet it proved to be exactly the right one. The interviews themselves, conducted patiently across kitchens in various towns, revealed comments that might easily have been dismissed as irrational by a less thoughtful research team. Women spoke of feeling almost guilty serving a cake that required so little effort, worried that guests or family members might somehow sense the shortcut, worried that the ease of it diminished the care behind the gesture. These were not complaints about flavour or texture. They were complaints about meaning, about what a cake was supposed to represent within a home. Understanding this took a particular kind of patience and humility from the company, a willingness to listen carefully to concerns that did not fit neatly into typical market research categories. It would have been easy to dismiss the hesitation as simple resistance to change, the kind every new product faces. Instead, the researchers took the discomfort seriously, treating it as valuable information rather than an inconvenient obstacle, and that decision would ultimately shape the direction of the entire product line moving forward. The research process itself involved considerably more than a handful of casual conversations. Home economists visiting kitchens directly, watching women prepare the mix as instructed, noting small hesitations, small moments of visible discomfort that a woman herself might never have thought to mention explicitly in a written survey. Watching someone actually stir a bowl of cake batter revealed information that no questionnaire alone could have captured. The particular pause before adding water, the slightly disappointed expression when the batter came together too easily, too quickly, without any of the familiar effort a cake was supposed to require. These observational sessions, unusual for their time in their depth and patience, eventually led researchers to a conclusion that seems almost obvious in retrospect, but required real insight to identify clearly. Convenience, however genuinely desired in the abstract, needed to be balanced carefully against a woman's need to feel that her own effort and care remained visibly present in the final result. Removing too much labour did not simply save time. It risked removing the very thing that made the finished cake feel like an accomplishment worth being proud of. This insight would go on to influence not just the cake mix itself, but the company's broader approach to product development for decades afterward. A guiding principle that any new convenience needed to leave behind enough genuine participation to preserve a customer's sense of ownership and pride. A lesson learned first, and most memorably from a bowl of cake batter that initially required nothing more than water. The fix came in the form of a single instruction: add an egg yourself. It seems like such a small thing, but it gave women back a sense of participation, a feeling that they were still the one making the cake, not simply following a machine's orders. Sales rose almost immediately, a quiet lesson in how much pride mattered, even inside something as small as a mixing bowl. The change required removing dried egg powder from the mix formula entirely, a step that, from a purely technical standpoint, made the product slightly more complicated to produce and slightly less convenient in theory. And yet in practice, it solved everything. Cracking an egg into the bowl, watching the yolk break and blend into the batter, gave the entire process just enough tactile involvement to feel meaningfully homemade again. It was a small ritual, barely 30 seconds of actual effort, but it restored something the earlier version had inadvertently stripped away. The cake once again felt like it belonged, at least partially, to the woman standing at the counter, rather than entirely to the factory that had produced the box. This adjustment became something of a quiet case study within the company, referenced for years afterward as an example of how thoroughly consumer psychology needed to be understood before assuming a product's success or failure. It was not enough to make something easier. The ease itself needed to feel appropriate, needed to leave behind just enough personal investment that the final result still carried a sense of ownership and pride. Kitchens across the country adjusted quickly to this small new ritual. Recipes on the box were reprinted with the instruction clearly highlighted, and advertising subtly shifted its language as well, moving away from emphasizing pure convenience and toward emphasizing the simple joy of baking, framing the egg addition not as an inconvenience but as the fun part, the moment where a woman's own hands truly shape the outcome. Decades later, that same instruction remains largely unchanged. Add an egg, add oil, add water, a small sequence so deeply embedded in American baking habits that few people today ever stop to consider why it exists at all. It exists because a team of researchers decades ago took seriously something that might have seemed like an irrational objection, and in doing so, uncovered a truth about pride and ownership that shaped an entire industry moving forward. Other companies in the years following took notice of this success as well, competing cake mix brands adjusting their own formulas to include similar fresh egg requirements, an entire industry gradually converging around the same basic insight that had first emerged from careful, patient listening rather than any bold, sweeping innovation. What began as a specific fix for a specific product eventually became a standard convention across the entire category, so thoroughly adopted that a mix requiring only water would have, by later decades, seemed like the unusual choice rather than the expected one. For the women actually cracking the egg each week, the psychological effect proved remarkably durable over time as well. Surveys conducted years after the initial change still showing that customers associated the fresh egg step specifically with the sense that the cake was, in some genuine way, still theirs. This small, deliberately reintroduced task had become, through years of repetition, its own small point of pride, a detail worth mentioning to a guest complimenting the cake, a reminder that however convenient the process had become, real hands had still shaped the final result. The lesson embedded in this single, small adjustment continued to echo through the company's product decisions for years afterward. A quiet reminder woven into training materials and product development meetings alike. Convenience sells, but only convenience that still leaves room for genuine pride truly endures. Picture the scene itself. A formica table catching the afternoon light, a mixing bowl borrowed from a mother or a grandmother, the paper box torn open along its perforated edge. The powder inside smelled faintly of vanilla and something almost chemical, new and modern, utterly unlike anything a kitchen had smelled like before 1947. That smell alone carried a kind of novelty that is difficult to fully appreciate now, decades removed from a time when baking from scratch was simply assumed to be the only option available. The kitchen itself, in most homes of this era, was a smaller, more compact space than what came later. Tiled in soft pastel colours, the counters often edged in chrome, the whole room humming faintly with the sound of a refrigerator working steadily in the corner. Sunlight came in through a single window above the sink, catching dust motes in the afternoon light, illuminating the counter where the mixing bowl sat waiting, borrowed, as so many kitchen tools were in this era, from an older relative's own collection. The box itself required a certain small ceremony to open properly, tearing along the perforated line printed clearly on the top, folding back the flaps to reveal the foil pouch inside. That foil pouch, itself a small marvel of modern packaging, kept the powder fresh and dry, protected from the humidity of a summer kitchen. Pouring it into the bowl released a fine cloud of white dust, catching the light for just a moment before settling. Then came the egg, cracked carefully against the rim, the yolk sliding free and breaking apart under the wooden spoon's steady stirring. The oil followed, and the water, and slowly, methodically, the mixture came together into something recognisably like batter, thick and pale, clinging to the spoon in a way that felt reassuringly familiar. No different, in that moment, from any cake batter a grandmother might have mixed from scratch decades earlier. The oven, meanwhile, had likely been warming for the better part of 10 minutes already, its own particular smell of heated metal filling the kitchen, mixing with the sweetness of the batter now being poured carefully into a greased pan. This was the quiet, unremarkable centre of so many American afternoons, a moment that asked for no audience and received none, and yet, multiplied across millions of kitchens throughout the decade, became one of the defining small rituals of an entire generation's domestic life. Children, if they happened to be home from school already or too young for school entirely, often gathered close during this particular ritual, drawn by the promise of licking the spoon once the batter had been poured, a small reward that required no explanation and needed none. They watched the beaters lift free of the bowl, batter clinging in thick ribbons before dropping slowly back down, fascinated by a transformation that felt, to a child's eye, close to genuine magic, powder and egg and water becoming, through nothing more than steady stirring, something that would soon fill the whole house with warmth and sweetness. The greasing of the pan itself carried its own small practiced motion. A stick of butter or a smear of shortening worked carefully into every corner with a folded paper towel, ensuring the finished cake would release cleanly once it had cooled. This small preparatory step, easy to overlook, represented years of accumulated kitchen wisdom passed down through direct observation, a daughter watching her mother's hands move through this same motion dozens of times before ever attempting it herself. Once the pan finally slid into the warm oven, the kitchen entered its own particular stretch of quiet anticipation, the batter transforming slowly and invisibly behind the closed oven door, while the rest of the afternoon's chores continued around it. Laundry folded, floors swept, the ordinary rhythm of a household carrying on even as something sweet and warm quietly took shape just a few feet away. For many households, a new electric mixer arrived around this same era, humming steadily on the counter. Another quiet promise that baking no longer required an aching arm and 20 minutes of patient stirring. Betty Crocker's recipes were written with this new machine already in mind, designed for a kitchen that was, slowly, becoming easier. The mixer itself often sat proudly on the counter rather than tucked away in a cupboard, a small status symbol as much as a practical tool, its chrome finish catching the light in a way that felt distinctly modern against the older, worn wooden furnishings many kitchens still carried from earlier decades. Before its arrival, creaming butter and sugar together by hand had been genuinely laborious work, requiring several minutes of steady, aching effort with a wooden spoon before the mixture reached the proper light, fluffy consistency a good cake required. The mixer reduced that same task to under a minute, its twin beaters spinning steadily, turning what had once been a small workout into something almost effortless. For women managing households with several children, several meals a day, and countless other unpaid tasks stacked one atop another, that saved time was not a small luxury. It was meaningfully significant. Recipes printed in the era's cookbooks began including specific instructions calibrated for the mixer's speed settings, low, medium, high, a level of precision that would have been meaningless just a decade earlier when every mixture was blended entirely by hand and feel. This shift represented something larger than simple convenience. It represented a broader transformation happening quietly across American kitchens throughout the decade, as new appliances steadily reduced the physical labor that had once defined so much of a housewife's day. And yet, even as the labor eased, the emotional weight of the kitchen did not necessarily lighten alongside it. Expectations rose to fill the space that convenience created. A woman who no longer needed 20 minutes to cream butter by hand was now expected, implicitly, to produce more elaborate meals, more frequent baked goods, more polished dinner parties, filling the newly freed time with new forms of domestic expectation rather than genuine rest. Still, in the moment itself, standing at the counter, listening to the steady hum of the mixer, doing work that once ached in her own forearm, there was something undeniably satisfying about it. A small, tangible symbol that the modern kitchen really was becoming, in its own quiet way, a slightly kinder place to spend an afternoon. Owning one of these mixers also carried its own quiet social dimension, a visible marker of a household that had kept pace with the era's steady march of modern conveniences. Neighbours comparing notes over morning coffee might discuss whose kitchen already had one, whose was still saving toward the purchase. The appliance functioning as a small, unspoken measure of a family's gradual climb toward the comfortable, appliance-filled kitchens depicted so consistently in magazine advertisements throughout the decade. For a woman finally bringing one home, often after months of careful saving, or as a treasured gift for a birthday or anniversary, there was a genuine sense of occasion in that first use, reading the accompanying instruction booklet carefully, testing each speed setting cautiously before trusting the machine with an actual recipe. That initial caution rarely lasted long, though, the mixer quickly becoming such a fixture of the weekly routine that its absence, on the rare occasion it required repair, left a kitchen feeling oddly incomplete. A woman finding herself reaching instinctively for a wooden spoon before remembering, with mild frustration, that her steady companion was temporarily unavailable. By the decade's end, the electric mixer had moved from novel luxury to near universal expectation, one more small, humming testament to how quickly a household task once defined by physical effort had been quietly, permanently transformed. Each year, the company hosted a national baking contest, drawing thousands of entries from home kitchens across the country. Winners were flown out, photographed, celebrated in their hometown newspapers. For a housewife whose days were mostly unseen, this was a rare and thrilling kind of recognition. Proof that her kitchen work mattered to someone beyond her own family. The entry process itself began quietly, often at a kitchen table late in the evening after children had gone to bed, a woman testing and retesting a recipe she'd been perfecting for months, sometimes years, adjusting a pinch of spice here, a half degree of oven temperature there, chasing a version of perfection only she could taste clearly enough to recognize. The scale of the contest was staggering for its time, drawing entries by the hundreds of thousands from every corner of the country, farm towns and city apartments alike. Women who had never once considered themselves particularly skilled, suddenly finding the courage to submit a family recipe passed down through some aunt or grandmother, reworked just slightly to fit the contest's requirements. For many, simply mailing in the entry card felt like a small act of bravery, an admission that she believed her cooking was good enough to be noticed. For the handful of finalists selected each year, the experience that followed felt almost dreamlike against the backdrop of ordinary domestic life. A train ticket arriving in the mail, a hotel room reserved in a city she may never have visited before, a real live kitchen set up especially for the competition, cameras and judges standing nearby, watching her measure flour and crack eggs, with the same steady hands she used every single week at her own counter, except now those hands were being observed, admired, taken seriously. Local newspapers back home covered these stories with real enthusiasm, running photographs of the woman standing proudly beside her winning dish, headlines naming her hometown alongside her accomplishment, as though she had brought some small piece of honour back to the whole community. Neighbours who might have passed her in the grocery store without much thought suddenly greeted her with genuine curiosity, asking about the recipe, asking what it felt like to stand in a real contest kitchen under those bright lights. There is something quietly significant in recognising what this contest actually offered beyond the modest prize money or brief moment of fame. It offered validation for work that was, in nearly every other context, treated as invisible, expected, unpaid, and largely unacknowledged. A meal prepared for a family every evening rarely earned applause. It was simply expected, absorbed into the rhythm of the household without much comment either way. But here, for one brief moment each year, that same quiet labour was placed under bright lights, and treated as something worth genuine admiration. Many of the recipes that emerged from these contests went on to become standard fixtures printed in later cookbook editions, tested and refined further by the company's own home economists before being shared with millions of other kitchens across the country. A woman's personal family recipe, something she may have learned at her own mother's elbow, could suddenly find its way into households she would never visit, prepared by hands she would never shake, quietly carrying her small legacy forward in a way she likely never imagined when she first sat down to write out the entry. And for the women who never won, who mailed in an entry and heard nothing back, there remained something valuable in the attempt itself, a private reminder that the quiet work of her kitchen held real skill, real creativity, worth measuring against the very best in the country, even if the recognition never came. The judging process itself was conducted with a seriousness that surprised many participants. Panels of trained home economists and, in later years, actual professional chefs tasting each finalist's dish under controlled blind conditions, evaluating not just flavour but presentation, originality, and how faithfully the dish could be replicated by an ordinary cook using ordinary ingredients from her own local grocery store. This last criterion mattered enormously to the contest's underlying philosophy. A dish too elaborate, requiring ingredients unavailable to most households, however delicious, would never advance far, since the entire enterprise existed to celebrate practical, achievable home cooking rather than professional culinary spectacle. For many finalists, the days spent at the competition itself became treasured memories recounted for decades afterward, described in letters and later interviews with a kind of wonder that never quite faded. Women recalled the specific dress they wore for the photographs, the particular nervousness of measuring ingredients while judges watched silently nearby, the overwhelming relief and joy of hearing their name called among the winners after months of private preparation at home. Even contestants who did not place among the top winners often described the experience itself as transformative in smaller, quieter ways, a validation that extended beyond any ribbon or prize money. Simply having been selected as a finalist among hundreds of thousands of entries offered proof that her particular skill, developed alone in her own kitchen over years of practice, was genuinely exceptional, worth the recognition of strangers who had tasted dishes from across the entire country and still found hers worth celebrating. Inside many kitchen drawers sat a small recipe box, index cards worn soft at the edges, some typed on official recipe pamphlets, others scrawled by hand in careful cursive. Betty Crocker recipes lived alongside grandmother's stuffing and a neighbour's pie crust, blending the manufactured and the personal until they became, somehow, indistinguishable. The box itself was often nothing fancy, a simple metal tin repurposed from some earlier use, or a wooden case bought specifically for this purpose from a 5 and dime store, its hinge slightly loose from years of daily opening and closing. Flip through one of these boxes today and you would find an entire quiet autobiography hidden in the handwriting alone. Recipes copied out carefully in a young bride's neat, careful script during her first year of marriage, the letters still uniform and deliberate. Later cards, added a decade on, written more quickly, more confidently, in a looser hand that no longer needed to think quite so hard about proportions or technique. Some cards carried small notes in the margins, reminders written to herself, too much salt, try less next time, or a favourite, always request seconds. The recipes themselves rarely stayed exactly as printed. A Betty Crocker card might sit beside a version of the same dish, altered slightly in pencil, a family's particular preference noted directly onto the original. Perhaps less sugar than the box suggested, perhaps an extra half cup of flour, because the family always seemed to prefer it a little denser. These small modifications, made quietly over years of repetition, represented something the manufactured recipe alone could never fully offer: the specific, particular taste of one family's own table. Some cards carried stains from decades of use, a faint ring where a buttery finger had once turned the corner, a small smear of vanilla extract that had long since dried into the paper itself. These marks, unintentional as they were, carried their own kind of history, physical evidence of a hand that had returned to this same recipe dozens, perhaps hundreds of times over the years, trusting it enough to keep coming back. When these boxes eventually passed from mother to daughter, as so many did, they carried forward something more valuable than mere instructions for combining ingredients. They carried an entire inherited sense of taste, an understanding of what a particular family considered a proper Sunday dinner, what dessert always appeared at a birthday celebration, which dish was reserved specifically for company, and which was saved quietly for a difficult week when comfort mattered more than presentation. In this way, the printed, mass-produced recipe and the deeply personal, handwritten family adaptation, existed side by side without any real contradiction, each one shaping the other over years of quiet, ordinary use. The recipe box, more than almost any other object in the kitchen, held the true layered story of a household, one card at a time. The organisation of these boxes, or often the delightful lack of it, told its own story as well. Some women kept theirs meticulously alphabetized, dividers labelled carefully in the same careful cursive as the cards themselves. Others allowed a looser, more organic system to develop over the years, favourite recipes migrating naturally toward the front where they could be located quickly, seldom used cards drifting gradually toward the back, an unspoken hierarchy of family favourites emerging simply through years of repeated use rather than any deliberate filing system. Occasionally, tucked among the recipe cards themselves, other small keepsakes accumulated as well. A newspaper clipping about a local event from decades earlier, a child's crayon drawing folded small enough to fit, a handwritten note from a friend thanking her for a dish brought to a funeral or a new baby's arrival. These small, unrelated additions transformed the recipe box into something closer to a scrapbook than a simple culinary reference, a container holding not just instructions for cooking, but small, scattered fragments of an entire life lived around that same kitchen table. For families fortunate enough to still possess one of these original boxes today, sorting through it often becomes its own quiet, emotional experience. Each card a small doorway back into a particular afternoon, a particular holiday, a particular version of a mother or grandmother whose handwriting alone can summon her voice and her kitchen back into vivid sensory memory. The genius of the whole enterprise was never really about the cake at all. It was about understanding, with real precision, what a 1950s housewife needed to feel. Capable, resourceful, in control of her home, even while being offered a shortcut. Betty Crocker never promised to replace her. She promised only to stand quietly beside her. This distinction, subtle as it may seem, shaped nearly every decision the company made, from packaging design to advertising language to the careful, deliberate tone used in every printed recipe. Advertisements from this era rarely emphasized how little effort a recipe required. Instead, they leaned into language about family pride, about the warm satisfaction of serving something homemade, about the quiet joy of watching a family gather eagerly around a table because of what she had made for them. The convenience was present, certainly, embedded in every box and every mix, but it was never the headline. The headline was always her skill, her care, her ability to create something worth being proud of. This careful balance required constant attention, a willingness to adjust course whenever consumer feedback suggested the tone had drifted too far in one direction or another. When early advertising leaned too heavily into emphasizing speed and simplicity, sales data and customer letters both suggested a quiet unease, the same discomfort that had emerged with the original cake mix formula. Women did not want to feel as though their labour had been rendered unnecessary. They wanted to feel supported in that labour, given better tools to accomplish something that still, ultimately belonged to them. The company's response to this ongoing tension revealed a surprisingly modern understanding of consumer psychology, decades before such language became commonplace in business. Rather than treating convenience as an unambiguous selling point, they treated it as a delicate ingredient, useful only in careful proportion, always balanced against something more essential, a woman's own sense of accomplishment, her belief that what she served her family reflected her own skill and care rather than a factory's efficient shortcut. This understanding shaped not just cake mixes but an entire product line that followed: pancake batter, pie crust mix, frosting in a can, each one carefully positioned as a helpful companion rather than a replacement for genuine effort. The message, repeated consistently across every product, remained the same. You are still the one making this meal. We're simply here to help. This philosophy extended even into how the company trained its own home economists and customer service representatives, instructing them explicitly never to use language suggesting a product made cooking unnecessary or effortless, but rather language emphasizing that it made good cooking more achievable, more consistent, more reliably successful. A representative answering a customer letter would never write that a mix eliminated the need for skill, but rather that it helped ensure a woman's existing skill produced reliable, beautiful results every single time. Market research conducted throughout the decade consistently reinforced this careful positioning, focus groups revealing again and again that women responded far more positively to language framing convenience as support rather than replacement. A phrase suggesting a product did the work for you, tested poorly compared to language suggesting a product helped you do your best work more easily. This distinction, seemingly minor on the surface, proved to carry enormous weight in how women actually felt about the products they were buying and serving to their families. Competitors who failed to grasp this same careful balance often struggled where Betty Crocker succeeded. Products marketed too aggressively around pure convenience, sometimes finding themselves quietly rejected by consumers who sensed, even if they could not articulate it precisely, that something essential about the pride and meaning of home cooking had been stripped away in the marketing itself. The lesson proved durable and instructive. Convenience sold best not when it promised to do less work for a woman, but when it promised to help her do her already considerable work just a little more easily, without ever suggesting that work was unnecessary in the first place. There is a particular smell that fills a kitchen when a cake is baking, warm and sweet, curling under the door and drifting down the hallway. For children coming home from school, that smell meant something specific. Mother was home, the oven was on, and for the next half hour at least, everything in the house felt steady and unhurried. It was a smell that reached the front step before the front door had even fully opened, a warm sweetness mixed faintly with the scent of the oven itself, slightly metallic, slightly toasted, the particular fragrance of an appliance working steadily at its task. Children arriving home in these years often described it as a kind of homing signal, an assurance that the house they were walking into was, for this moment at least, calm and predictable. The school day, with its own particular stresses and uncertainties, could be set down at the threshold, replaced by the simple comfort of knowing exactly what waited inside. A snack, perhaps, if the cake had already come out and cooled slightly. Or simply the anticipation of it, the smell alone enough to make the afternoon feel settled. For the woman standing at the stove or seated nearby with a cup of coffee, waiting for the timer to ring, this smell represented something different, a quiet marker of the day's progress, proof that despite whatever else had happened that morning, whatever laundry remained unfolded or whatever chores had gone unfinished, this one task had been completed successfully. The cake would rise. The kitchen would smell the way a proper home was supposed to smell, and soon enough family would gather round it, drawn by that same fragrance now filling every room. There was a rhythm to these afternoons that repeated itself across countless households throughout the decade. The timer's soft ring, the careful opening of the oven door, the toothpick inserted gently into the centre to check for doneness, the cake set on a wire rack to cool while the kitchen slowly filled with its warmth. Outside, the afternoon light shifted lower, the day easing toward evening, dinner preparations soon to follow. It is the kind of ordinary, unremarkable moment that rarely made its way into any advertisement or cookbook photograph, and yet it may have been the truest measure of what all of this baking was really for. Not the finished cake itself, elegant on a cake stand, photographed for a magazine spread, but simply the smell of it, filling an ordinary house on an ordinary Tuesday, telling a child without a single word spoken that they were home. Neighbours too sometimes caught traces of this same fragrance, drifting between houses on a warm afternoon, windows left open to catch a breeze. The specific sweetness of vanilla and sugar carrying just far enough to reach a porch next door, where someone else's children played. In close-knit neighbourhoods, this shared ambient sweetness became its own quiet form of community, a reminder that similar rituals were unfolding simultaneously in kitchen after kitchen along the same street, each family's version slightly different in flavour and occasion, but fundamentally, comfortingly the same. For a mother managing several children across a demanding afternoon, that particular smell also served as a kind of unspoken promise fulfilled, evidence to herself as much as to her family that she had, despite everything else pulling at her attention, still found the time and care to bake something from scratch, or nearly from scratch, for the people she loved. It was a small, private satisfaction, rarely spoken aloud, but deeply felt nonetheless. Each time that warm sweetness filled the kitchen and drifted inevitably toward the front door to greet whoever walked through it next. It did not take long before her name expanded well beyond cake mix. Betty Crocker appeared on pancake batter, on pie crust mix, on frosting cans lined up neatly on grocery store shelves. Her face became a kind of quiet promise, printed across dozens of products, a signal that told a shopper without needing a second thought that this was safe, familiar, and worth trusting. Walking down a grocery aisle in this era, a shopper might encounter her portrait a half-dozen times before reaching the checkout counter, each appearance slightly different in product, but identical in its underlying message of reliability. This expansion happened gradually and deliberately, each new product carefully tested before earning the right to carry her name and likeness. The company understood that trust, once built, could just as easily be diminished by careless overextension, a product that disappointed a customer risking damage not just to that single item, but to the entire carefully constructed reputation behind the name. Every new addition to the product line underwent the same rigorous taste testing and consumer feedback process that had shaped the original cake mix. For the shopper standing in the aisle, this consistency simplified an otherwise overwhelming decision. Grocery shelves in this era were filling rapidly with new products, new brands, new promises of convenience and quality, more choices than any previous generation of homemakers had ever faced. In the middle of this expanding, sometimes bewildering landscape, a familiar face offered a small, comforting shortcut, a way of narrowing choices without needing to research or taste test every competing option personally. Pie crust mix in particular solved a problem that had frustrated even experienced bakers for generations. The delicate balance of flour and fat required to produce a crust that was flaky rather than tough, a skill that had traditionally taken years to master properly. Suddenly, that same result could be achieved reliably by any household, regardless of experience, simply by following clearly printed instructions. Frosting, too, arrived as a genuine convenience, no longer requiring the careful, sometimes finicky process of achieving the correct consistency by hand. The canned version promised the same smooth, glossy finish every single time, removing one more small anxiety from an already demanding process of preparing a proper dessert for company. Across every one of these products, the underlying message remained remarkably consistent. This was not about replacing skill. It was about removing unnecessary difficulty from tasks that had always been, at their heart, acts of care and generosity toward family and guests alike. Pancake batter mix arrived with its own particular set of challenges to overcome, since a pancake, unlike a cake baked hidden inside a covered pan, was cooked openly on a griddle in full view of the family being served, its texture and colour immediately apparent to anyone watching. This visibility meant the mix needed to perform reliably every single time, producing a consistent golden colour and fluffy texture regardless of the specific stove or griddle it was cooked on, a technical challenge the company's test kitchen spent considerable time perfecting before the product ever reached wider distribution. The expansion into these new categories also required careful attention to how each product's packaging visually related to the others. The same red script, the same warm colour palette, the same reassuring portrait, arranged consistently enough that a shopper could recognise the brand family instantly, even while distinguishing easily between a box of pancake mix and a box of cake mix sitting beside it on the same shelf. This visual consistency, seemingly a minor design detail, actually required careful coordination across the company's various product teams, each one contributing to a single, cohesive brand identity rather than developing separate, potentially conflicting visual approaches for their own individual products. By the decade's end, this careful, deliberate expansion had transformed a single successful cake mix into an entire trusted ecosystem of kitchen products, each one reinforcing the others, each new purchase strengthening rather than diluting the underlying promise that had made the very first product successful in the first place. Not every kitchen matched the gleaming sunlit photographs printed alongside her recipes. Many were small, a little worn, lit by a single overhead bulb, the linoleum curling faintly at the corners, and yet the same box sat on the same kind of counter in nearly every one of them, a small, shared thread running quietly through very different homes. The advertisements themselves depicted a particular kind of kitchen, spacious, bright, outfitted with the latest appliances, a vision of domestic modernity that remained, for many families, still somewhat aspirational rather than immediately achievable. The reality across much of the country looked considerably more modest. A farmhouse kitchen might still rely on a wood-burning stove well into the decade, its walls darkened slightly by decades of cooking smoke, its floor worn smooth in the particular path a woman walked dozens of times each day between stove and counter and sink. A small city apartment kitchen might offer barely enough counter space to mix a single bowl of batter, its single window facing not a sunlit yard but the brick wall of the building next door. And yet within these considerably humbler spaces, the same red and white box appeared just as often as it did in the gleaming advertisement photographs, proof that the product's appeal crossed economic and geographic lines more thoroughly than almost any other household item of its era. A woman in a cramped city kitchen and a woman on a rural farmstead might never meet, might live lives that looked almost entirely different from one another in every other respect, and yet both might reach for the very same box on a Tuesday afternoon, trusting the same familiar name. This universality mattered more than it might initially seem. In a country still deeply divided along regional economic and cultural lines throughout this decade, there were remarkably few genuine points of shared experience connecting a farm wife in the rural Midwest to an apartment dweller in a northeastern city. A shared brand, however commercial its origins, however manufactured its friendly persona, offered one small genuine point of connection, a shared cultural touchstone crossing boundaries that otherwise kept these women's lives quite separate. For the company itself, this cross-section of loyal customers represented remarkable success, certainly. but it also represented something the marketing team likely never fully anticipated: a small, quiet unification of domestic experience across a large and varied country. One box, one cake, one kitchen at a time. Some of the humbler kitchens across the country lacked even basic conveniences that more affluent households already took entirely for granted: a working refrigerator, reliable running water, an oven with an accurate temperature gauge rather than one requiring careful guesswork, and years of accumulated intuition to use properly. For women baking in these more challenging conditions, the standardized, carefully tested recipes offered something particularly valuable: a fixed point of reliability in a kitchen where so many other variables remain genuinely unpredictable. The company's own test kitchens, aware of this wide variance in actual home kitchen conditions, deliberately tested recipes across a range of equipment quality, understanding that a recipe developed exclusively using pristine, professional-grade ovens would fail consistently once it reached the many households still relying on older, less precise equipment. This attention to real-world variability, rather than idealized conditions, represented another quiet but significant reason the brand succeeded so broadly across such genuinely different kitchens and circumstances. For a family finally able to afford a proper modern oven, replacing an older wood-burning stove after years of saving, that same trusted recipe, prepared now under considerably improved conditions, often produced noticeably better results, offering its own small private marker of a family's gradual economic progress, measured not in any grand statement, but simply in a cake that finally rose exactly as evenly and beautifully as the photograph on the box had always promised it could. For years, letters addressed to Betty Crocker received a personal reply, warm and specific, offering advice about a fallen cake or a lumpy gravy. Of course, no single woman sat writing each one. A team of home economists answered on her behalf, yet the tone remained so consistent, so kind, that most women never once questioned who was really on the other end. These letters arrived by the thousands each month, addressed in careful handwriting to a woman these correspondents had never met and, in truth, never could meet, yet clearly felt they knew. The letters themselves covered an enormous range of concerns, some practical and specific, others carrying a quieter undertone of anxiety about performing this domestic role correctly. A young bride might write, asking precisely how long to roast a chicken of a particular size, worried about serving her new husband's family an improperly cooked dinner. An older woman might write asking for advice on a recipe that had suddenly stopped working the way it always had, wondering if her oven had somehow changed, or if she herself had simply lost some essential skill. The team responsible for answering these letters understood something important about their responsibility, that these were not simply technical questions requiring technical answers, but often carried an emotional weight the letter itself might not fully articulate. A woman asking about a fallen cake was sometimes also quietly asking whether she was failing at something. Everyone else around her seemed to manage easily. The responses, therefore, were crafted with genuine care, technical guidance wrapped in warmth and reassurance, never a hint of judgment for the question having been asked at all. This correspondence eventually grew large enough that the company maintained an entire department dedicated solely to answering it. Women trained specifically in both culinary technique and in the particular gentle tone that had come to define the Betty Crocker voice across every other form of communication. New hires studied previous correspondence carefully, learning to write in a manner indistinguishable from their colleagues, preserving the illusion of a single, consistent woman, even as dozens of different hands drafted the actual replies. For the women who wrote in and received these thoughtful responses, the illusion mattered less than the substance behind it. Whether or not a single woman truly existed on the other end, the advice was genuine, tested, reliable, and delivered with a warmth that made an anxious cook feel considerably less alone in her kitchen, however many miles away that response may have travelled to reach her. The volume of mail itself required careful, methodical organisation, letters sorted by topic and urgency, some requiring only a standardised reply drawn from an established library of previously answered questions, others clearly requiring a more personal, individually crafted response, given the specific and sometimes quite personal details a letter writer had chosen to share. This sorting process itself demanded real judgment, a trained eye able to distinguish quickly between a routine technical question and a letter that carried something closer to genuine emotional distress beneath its polite, careful phrasing. Occasionally letters arrived that extended well beyond simple recipe questions entirely. Women writing about difficult marriages, about financial hardship, about the isolation of raising children far from extended family, using the safety of an anonymous, trusted correspondence to voice concerns they might never have shared with an actual acquaintance. The company's policy in these cases leaned toward gentle, compassionate acknowledgement rather than overreach, offering warmth and understanding within the response while steering the actual advice back toward the kitchen, the one domain where the company could genuinely, reliably help. These letters, preserved in company archives for decades afterward, offer historians today an unusually intimate window into the private anxieties and quiet daily concerns of an entire generation of American women, concerns rarely documented so directly and honestly anywhere else, revealed only because a fictional woman's carefully maintained warmth had made it feel safe enough to ask. As television entered American living rooms, Betty Crocker followed, appearing in short cooking segments that walked viewers gently through a recipe from start to finish. She spoke slowly, warmly, the way you might speak to a nervous new cook standing beside you, never rushing, never making anyone feel foolish for not already knowing. These segments required, for the first time, an actual living woman to portray the character on screen, a task approached with considerable care by the company, since the actress selected needed to embody, convincingly and consistently, a personality that millions of women had already spent years imagining through radio broadcasts and printed cookbooks alone. The transition from an imagined voice to an actual visible presence carried real risk. A woman's mental image of Betty Crocker, built patiently over years of radio listening and cookbook reading, might not match whatever face and mannerisms actually appeared on the television screen. The company approached this challenge with the same careful research it applied to every other aspect of the character, testing potential actresses extensively, gathering feedback from focus groups of actual housewives about which candidate best matched their existing expectations. Once selected, these television segments followed a format designed to feel less like a formal cooking show and more like an intimate visit from a knowledgeable friend. The set itself was designed to resemble an ordinary, comfortable kitchen, rather than a professional studio, warm lighting, homey touches, nothing that might feel intimidating or unattainable to the average viewer watching from her own considerably more modest kitchen at home. The pacing of each segment mattered enormously. Instructions were repeated where necessary, technique demonstrated slowly and clearly, ingredients measured out with visible, careful precision, so that a viewer could pause her own preparations and follow along step by step without feeling rushed or left behind. This patience, consistent across every appearance, reinforced the same underlying promise that had defined the character from her earliest radio days. Whatever your current skill level, you are capable of following along successfully. For many families, these television segments became a small weekly ritual of their own, a mother settling in briefly before beginning dinner preparations, sometimes with a daughter watching alongside her, both absorbing the same patient instruction together. In this quiet way, the television broadcast extended the character's original purpose into an entirely new medium, still offering the same steady companionship, simply now with a face and voice to match the name so many had already come to trust. The technical demands of early television production added their own particular challenges to these broadcasts. Live performances requiring an actress to complete an entire recipe accurately within a fixed time slot with no opportunity for editing or a second take should something go wrong on camera. This live format required considerable rehearsal beforehand, every measurement and movement practiced repeatedly until the actual broadcast felt effortless, despite the very real pressure of live television production happening just behind the warm, comfortable set. Viewer mail responding specifically to these television appearances added a new dimension to the ongoing correspondence the company already maintained. Women writing now not just about recipes but about the broadcast itself, commenting on the actress's particular warmth, requesting she demonstrate a specific technique again in a future episode, or simply expressing gratitude for the company these segments provided during an otherwise quiet afternoon at home. This feedback shaped future broadcasts directly, popular techniques repeated in subsequent episodes, less successful segments quietly phased out in favour of formats viewers responded to more enthusiastically. As the decade progressed and television sets became more common across American households, these segments increasingly reached audiences who might never have encountered the character through radio or print alone, extending her reach into a genuinely new generation of younger housewives who came to know her first and primarily through this visual, more immediate medium, her voice and face now permanently fused together in a way the earlier decades of a radio alone had never quite achieved. Behind the friendly branding sat a careful, deliberate strategy. Every recipe, every packaging choice, every line of advertising copy was tested and adjusted based on real feedback from real women, gathered through surveys and taste panels. The company understood something many others missed. Trust was not free, and it needed constant, quiet maintenance. This process began long before any product reached store shelves, with test kitchens staffed by trained home economists preparing recipes dozens of times over, adjusting proportions by small fractions until a dish reached genuine consistency, regardless of who prepared it or which kitchen it was made in. Beyond the test kitchen itself, the company relied heavily on organised taste panels, groups of ordinary women recruited from surrounding neighbourhoods and invited in to sample new products before they ever reached wider distribution. These sessions were conducted with genuine rigour. Participants asked detailed questions about flavour, texture, ease of preparation, and overall satisfaction, their feedback recorded carefully and fed directly back into the product development process. This commitment to listening extended into the advertising itself, copy drafted and redrafted based on how real women responded to specific language and imagery. A phrase that tested well among younger brides might land poorly among more experienced homemakers, and the company adjusted its messaging by region and audience accordingly, understanding that no single tone would resonate identically across every household in the country. Consumer letters, too, factored heavily into this ongoing process. Complaints and compliments alike reviewed regularly by product teams looking for patterns that might suggest a needed adjustment. A repeated complaint about a cake mix's texture, however minor, might trigger a full reformulation effort, the company unwilling to let even small dissatisfactions accumulate into genuine distrust. This careful, ongoing attentiveness represented a significant investment of time and resources, one that many competing companies of the era simply did not match. and it paid dividends precisely in the currency that mattered most for a brand built around trust and reliability. Consistent customer loyalty across generations. Households that continued reaching for the same familiar box decade after decade, confident that whatever sat inside would perform exactly as expected, because someone, somewhere, had genuinely bothered to ask real women what they needed, and had listened carefully to the answer. The taste panels themselves operated on a surprisingly rigorous schedule, meeting regularly throughout the year to evaluate not just entirely new products, but ongoing, subtle refinements to existing recipes, as ingredient suppliers occasionally changed, or as regional variations in flour or sugar quality required small formula adjustments to maintain the exact same reliable result nationwide. Participants in these panels often serve for extended periods, sometimes years, building genuine expertise in articulating precisely what made a cake texture feel right, or a frosting consistency feel appropriately luxurious rather than merely adequate. This deep well of accumulated consumer insight eventually became one of the company's most valuable, if least visible, assets. A continuously updated understanding of exactly what several generations of American women actually wanted from their kitchen products, refined through thousands of individual taste tests and tens of thousands of individual letters, each one contributing some small piece to an overall picture that guided nearly every decision the company made moving forward. Competitors attempting to match this same level of trust often found themselves unable to replicate it quickly, since the relationship itself had been built patiently, conversation by conversation, letter by letter, across more than 2 decades of consistent, genuine attentiveness that could not simply be manufactured overnight through clever advertising alone. Somewhere in nearly every home, a covered casserole dish sat waiting for a Betty Crocker recipe, usually something built from a can of soup, a box of noodles, and whatever meat was on hand that week. These dishes were not glamorous, but they were dependable, familiar, the kind of dinner a tired mother could make without opening the book twice. The dish itself, often a simple ceramic or glass baking pan passed down from an older relative, occupied a particular, well-worn place in the cupboard, pulled out so frequently that its exact location never needed to be searched for. The appeal of these casseroles lay precisely in their forgiving nature. Unlike a delicate cake requiring precise measurements and careful timing, a casserole tolerated substitution and improvisation without much consequence. Leftover chicken from Sunday's dinner could easily replace the tuna a recipe originally called for. A slightly different canned soup, whatever happened to be in the pantry that week, rarely disrupted the final result in any noticeable way. This flexibility made the casserole an especially practical solution for households managing tight budgets, allowing a resourceful woman to use up whatever remained in her pantry, rather than making a special trip to the store for ingredients she did not already have on hand. The preparation itself required minimal active attention, a welcome relief on evenings already crowded with other responsibilities, children needing homework help, laundry still waiting to be folded, a husband arriving home hungry after a long day. Once assembled and placed in the oven, the casserole required little more than an occasional glance to check on browning, freeing up considerable time for whatever else the evening demanded. For children growing up in these households, certain casseroles became deeply associated with specific evenings of the week, a particular dish appearing so reliably on a given night that its absence would have felt genuinely strange. This predictability, often dismissed as merely practical necessity, carried its own quiet comfort, children knowing exactly what to expect when they sat down at the table. One small, stable point in an otherwise unpredictable childhood. Decades later, many of these same recipes remain in family rotation, passed down not through any formal cookbook, but simply through repetition and memory, a daughter recreating from recollection alone the particular casserole her mother made every Wednesday evening, carrying forward a small, unglamorous tradition that nonetheless represents, in its own modest way, exactly the kind of quiet domestic continuity Betty Crocker had always been designed to support. The rise of the casserole itself owed a great deal to the broader post-war expansion of canned and processed convenience ingredients, canned soup in particular becoming, almost overnight, a foundational building block for an entire category of weeknight cooking. A single can of cream soup, whether mushroom, celery or chicken, could serve as an instant binding sauce, eliminating the need to prepare a sauce from scratch, itself a task requiring skill and attention many exhausted evening cooks simply did not have the energy to spare. Regional variations on the basic casserole formula developed naturally across the country, a version common in the Midwest built around ground beef and canned corn looking quite different from a version popular along the coast built instead around canned tuna and peas, yet both drawing from the exact same underlying template that Betty Crocker recipes had helped popularize and standardize nationwide. This adaptability, allowing the same basic formula to flex according to regional taste and available ingredients, contributed significantly to the casserole's enduring widespread popularity throughout the decade and well beyond it, cementing its place as perhaps the single most representative dish of an entire era's approach to practical, resourceful home cooking. For many families, that same red cookbook eventually made its way from a mother's kitchen shelf into her daughter's first apartment, spine cracked, pages splattered, certain recipes circled or starred in pencil. It became less a manual and more a kind of inheritance, carrying a family's specific tastes forward, one generation at a time. The handoff itself often happened quietly, without much ceremony, tucked into a box of other household items as a daughter packed for her first apartment or her new life as a young bride. The cookbook simply assumed to be part of what she would need, the way a good set of towels or a sturdy mixing bowl might be assumed necessary as well. What made this particular inheritance meaningful was not the book itself, identical to millions of other copies printed that same year, but rather everything a mother had added to it over her own years of use. The pencil marks in the margins carried specific instructions unique to this one family's preferences, a note beside the pot roast recipe, reminding whoever read it next that this family always preferred it, cooked an extra 30 minutes, or a small star beside the spice cake that had become, over years of repetition, the requested birthday dessert for every child in the household. A daughter opening this book in her own first kitchen found herself, often without fully realizing it, being guided not simply by a company's printed instructions, but by her own mother's accumulated wisdom, layered quietly on top of that original text. The cookbook had become, through years of daily use, something closer to a conversation between two women across time, one offering guidance in careful pencil script, the other following it faithfully in her own new kitchen, sometimes miles away from where that guidance had first been written down. There was often a particular tenderness in the moment a young woman first noticed these small annotations, recognizing her mother's handwriting in the margins of a book she had perhaps flipped through countless times as a child without ever truly reading it. A note beside a favourite cookie recipe, always double this recipe, they go fast, might suddenly carry an unexpected emotional weight, evidence of a mother's own careful attention to her family's particular joys, preserved now in ink long after that same mother might be many miles away, or in some cases no longer living at all. For families where several daughters eventually left home, this same cookbook sometimes became a source of gentle negotiation, each daughter wanting the specific copy carrying their mother's handwriting rather than simply purchasing a fresh, unmarked edition of her own. A newer copy, however identical in its printed content, lacked the essential thing that made the original valuable: the accumulated evidence of one particular woman's kitchen, one particular family's specific preferences, passed down not through formal instruction, but through the quiet, patient accumulation of small handwritten notes over years of ordinary use. In this way, a mass-produced object, identical to countless others manufactured in the very same factory, became through years of individual use something genuinely singular, irreplaceable, carrying forward not just recipes but an entire inherited sensibility about what a proper family meal looked like, what deserved to be doubled, what deserved an extra 30 minutes, what deserved, quietly, a small pencil star beside its name. This particular kind of inheritance carried a weight that a simple recipe alone could never quite replicate, since it arrived bundled together with an entire accumulated context, a memory of the specific kitchen in which it had first been tested, the specific occasions on which it had always appeared, the specific praise it had always earned from a particular uncle or a particularly picky younger brother. A daughter preparing this recipe for the first time in her own kitchen often found herself narrating these small family details aloud to whoever happened to be nearby, passing the story forward alongside the recipe itself, ensuring that the dish carried its full history rather than simply its ingredients. Some families developed their own quiet rituals around this particular inheritance, a mother deliberately setting aside a specific holiday to formally pass the cookbook along, treating the moment with a small measure of ceremony rather than allowing it to happen simply as an incidental part of ordinary moving preparations. For these families, the cookbook itself became something closer to a family heirloom in the more traditional sense, discussed and anticipated well before the actual handoff occurred, understood by everyone involved to carry significance well beyond its practical usefulness in the kitchen. And for those daughters who eventually became mothers themselves, the responsibility of adding their own annotations to this same inherited book carried its own quiet weight, an awareness that whatever she wrote in the margins today might eventually be read by a granddaughter she would never meet, a great-grandchild many decades removed from the original 1950s kitchen where this whole quiet tradition had first begun. In this way, the cookbook itself became a living document, continuously updated across generations, each new hand adding its own small contribution to an ongoing, unfinished record of one family's particular relationship with food, memory and care. Without ever intending to, Betty Crocker helped standardize what a home-cooked meal actually meant across the country, from small farm towns to city apartments. A casserole recipe printed in Minnesota might be baked the very same week in a kitchen in Georgia, quietly stitching together a shared national idea of what dinner should taste like. Before this era of mass-distributed cookbooks and nationally marketed products, regional cooking traditions had remained considerably more distinct, shaped by local ingredients, local climate, and generations of specifically regional family recipes passed down largely through oral tradition alone. The arrival of a single, widely distributed cookbook and a consistent line of products available in nearly every grocery store across the country began, gradually, and without any deliberate cultural intention, to blur some of these regional distinctions. A woman in rural Nebraska and a woman in suburban Connecticut might now prepare on the very same Tuesday evening remarkably similar versions of the same casserole, following the very same printed instructions, using ingredients purchased from the very same nationally distributed brand. This standardization carried both a quiet loss and a quiet gain, worth acknowledging honestly rather than romanticizing entirely. Some distinctly regional dishes, recipes that had once been passed carefully within specific communities for generations, gradually gave way to these more universally distributed alternatives, families slowly replacing grandmother's specific, locally rooted version of a dish with the more standardized recipe printed in a nationally available cookbook. Something genuinely specific and rooted in place was, in some households, quietly lost in this exchange. And yet something was gained as well, a shared sense of national culinary identity that had not quite existed in the same way before. Families who moved frequently during this era, as many did during the post-war years of economic mobility, found comfort in this consistency. A woman relocating from one state to another could walk into an unfamiliar grocery store and find the very same familiar box waiting on the shelf, could prepare the very same dinner her family had always known, regardless of how far from home she now found herself living. This quiet standardization extended beyond mere convenience into something closer to genuine cultural cohesion, a shared vocabulary of specific dishes and specific brand names that families across vastly different regions and backgrounds could nonetheless recognize and discuss together. A conversation between two women who had never met, one from the rural Midwest and one from a northeastern city, might discover almost immediately that they had both prepared the exact same casserole for dinner that same week, drawn from the exact same familiar red and white box. In this way, without any grand cultural ambition behind it, a simple cake mix company quietly helped knit together a more unified sense of what American home cooking actually meant. One shared casserole, one shared cake, one shared kitchen ritual at a time, across a country that in so many other respects remained considerably more divided and distinct. This process of standardization unfolded gradually enough that few people living through it likely noticed the broader pattern taking shape around them, each household simply making its own small, practical decision to try a new, convenient recipe rather than continue with an older, more labor-intensive family tradition. Only in hindsight, looking back across an entire decade rather than any single kitchen or any single evening, does the cumulative effect become genuinely visible, an entire country's dinner tables gradually converging toward a shared, recognizable set of dishes regardless of region or background. Food historians examining this period later noted how certain distinctly regional ingredients, once central to specific local cuisines, gradually receded in everyday household use, replaced by the more universally available, nationally marketed alternatives that fit so conveniently into standardized recipes. A particular regional spice blend, once passed down carefully within a specific immigrant community, might quietly give way over a generation or two to a more generic, nationally available seasoning mix, the original distinctive flavour surviving afterward, mostly in memory rather than in actual, ongoing practice. Yet this same standardization also created unexpected pathways for genuine cultural exchange as well. Families encountering recipes and flavour combinations through these nationally distributed cookbooks that they might never have discovered otherwise, given the more limited regional isolation of earlier generations. A family with no direct connection to a particular region might nonetheless come to regularly prepare a dish that had originated there, simply because it had been included, tested, and popularized through this same widely shared cookbook, spreading a small piece of regional culinary tradition far beyond its original community. By the decade's end, this quiet blending of regional and national culinary identity had become simply an accepted, unremarkable feature of everyday American life, families rarely pausing to consider how thoroughly a single company's carefully tested recipes had helped shape not just what appeared on their own dinner table, but what appeared, with remarkable consistency, on dinner tables across an entire vast and varied country, one familiar casserole at a time. Some of the era's advertising leaned gently into something rarely spoken aloud. The isolation many housewives felt, alone in the kitchen for long stretches of the day. Betty Crocker's friendly, ever-present voice offered a strange kind of companionship, a presence in the room, even when no other adult was there to talk to. This particular isolation, while rarely discussed openly in the polite, cheerful language typical of the era's magazines and advertisements, was nonetheless a genuine, widespread experience for countless women managing households largely alone during daytime hours, husbands away at work, children away at school, entire mornings and afternoons passing with barely another adult voice to break the silence. The company's advertising team, whether through careful research or simple intuitive understanding, recognized this quiet loneliness as a genuine emotional need worth addressing, even if only implicitly. The warm, conversational tone used consistently across radio broadcasts, printed recipes, and later television appearances was crafted specifically to feel like companionship rather than mere instruction. A friendly voice filling what might otherwise be a silent kitchen. Radio broadcasts in particular served this purpose effectively, arriving at a scheduled time each week that many women structured their entire morning routine around, not simply for the recipe information offered, but for the simple comfort of hearing another voice, warm and familiar, speaking directly to her during hours that might otherwise stretch long and quiet. Letters written to the company frequently mentioned this aspect explicitly, women describing how much they looked forward to the broadcast each week, less for any specific recipe, and more simply for the companionship the program provided during an otherwise solitary stretch of her day. This understanding shaped advertising copy in subtle but consistent ways, language that spoke directly and personally to the reader, using phrases that suggested an ongoing, personal relationship rather than a simple commercial transaction. Advertisements addressed the reader as though continuing an established conversation, referencing previous recipes or previous advice as though both parties shared a genuine history together, reinforcing the illusion of an ongoing friendship rather than a one-time commercial interaction. For women managing genuine isolation during these years, particularly those who had moved away from extended family for a husband's work opportunity, or those living in newer suburban developments where neighbourly relationships had not yet had time to form fully, this manufactured companionship filled a real and meaningful gap, however artificial its origins may have been. It could never fully replace genuine human connection, certainly, but it offered something during the specific hours when genuine connection simply was not available. A warm, familiar voice reminding her that she was not entirely alone in her kitchen, even when, in the most literal sense, she certainly was. This particular isolation looked considerably different from household to household, of course, and the company's messaging attempted with varying degrees of success to speak to this range of circumstances. A young bride newly relocated to an unfamiliar suburb, still waiting for genuine friendships to form among her new neighbours, experienced a very different quality of loneliness than an older woman whose children had recently left home, her days suddenly quieter after decades spent, surrounded by the constant noise and demands of a full household. The advertising's warm, consistent tone attempted to speak gently across this entire range, offering the same steady companionship regardless of the specific circumstances that had led any particular woman to feel it so keenly. Sociologists and cultural historians examining this era later identified this particular form of domestic isolation as a genuine, if largely undocumented, feature of post-war suburban life, a consequence partly of the era's rapid suburban expansion itself, families relocating quickly into newly built developments where established community bonds simply had not yet had time to take root. into this genuine social gap, a company's carefully cultivated, endlessly patient voice found fertile ground, offering something considerably more substantial than simple recipe instruction to women navigating a genuinely new and sometimes quietly difficult version of American domestic life. It is worth noting too that this manufactured companionship never claimed to be anything other than what it was, at least not explicitly. The company never suggested that Betty Crocker could replace an actual friend, an actual conversation, an actual shared cup of coffee with someone who could reciprocate genuine care and attention. What she offered instead was something more modest and, in its own way, more honest. Consistency, availability and warmth, delivered reliably at the same hour each week, asking nothing in return. For many women who lived through this particular era of suburban isolation, this small, consistent companionship remained a genuinely cherished memory decades later, recalled not with any embarrassment about having relied on something so seemingly artificial, but with a quiet gratitude that something, anything, had reliably filled those long solitary hours until the genuine friendships and community connections she eventually built could take their place. There is a particular tenderness, too, in recognizing how carefully this companionship was calibrated to avoid ever feeling intrusive or overbearing. The voice never demanded attention, never asked a listener to set aside her other responsibilities, simply arrived gently at its scheduled hour and offered whatever comfort it could within that brief familiar window before receding again into quiet until the following week. This restraint, easy to overlook, reflected its own kind of respect for the listener's time and independence, understanding that genuine comfort rarely announces itself loudly, but instead settles quietly into the background of an ordinary day, present exactly when needed and never demanding more than that. Not every product succeeded. Some mixes vanished after only a season or two, quietly pulled from shelves after lukewarm sales, their existence preserved only in old advertisements and yellowing newspaper clippings. For every cake mix that became a staple, there was another that never found its place at the table. These forgotten products offer their own quiet, less celebrated history, worth remembering alongside the more famous successes, since they reveal just as much about what American households actually wanted from their kitchens during this particular decade. Some failures resulted from simple miscalculation, a flavor combination that tested poorly once it reached wider distribution, a texture that never quite matched the company's own test kitchen results, once prepared in the varied ovens and kitchens of actual customers across the country. Others failed for reasons closer to the psychological complexity that had nearly doomed the original cake mix, products that removed too much genuine participation from the cooking process, leaving customers feeling, once again, that uncomfortable sense of having been replaced rather than assisted. A particular gelatin-based dessert mix, heavily promoted for several years running, never quite achieved the lasting popularity the company had originally anticipated, eventually fading quietly from most grocery shelves by the decade's end. Advertisements for it survive today mostly as curiosities, photographed in bright, optimistic colour schemes typical of the era, promoting a dessert that, in retrospect, never quite captured the genuine affection so many other products managed to secure. Other discontinued items reveal something interesting about shifting tastes across the decade itself. Products initially popular in its earlier years gradually falling out of favour as American palates and expectations evolved. A particular instant pudding variety, immensely popular for several years, eventually lost its footing as newer, improved formulations from competing companies offered a texture and flavour closer to genuinely homemade pudding, something the original version had never quite managed to replicate convincingly. These quiet failures, largely forgotten today, nonetheless played a valuable role in shaping the company's overall success, each discontinued product offering genuine data about what worked and what did not, informing the careful, ongoing research that continued to refine the products that did succeed. In this way, even commercial failure served a quiet, useful purpose, one more piece of feedback in an ongoing, decades-long conversation between a company and the millions of women it was trying, however imperfectly at times, to genuinely understand and serve. The internal company records surrounding these discontinued products, where they survive at all, reveal a genuinely humble and self-critical approach to failure that many outside observers might not expect from a brand so publicly associated with unwavering, cheerful confidence. Internal memos discussing a disappointing product launch often included detailed breakdowns of exactly where the miscalculation occurred, whether in flavor, in marketing tone, or simply in poor timing relative to a shifting cultural moment, treating each failure as a genuine learning opportunity rather than something to be quickly buried and forgotten without honest reflection. Some of these discontinued products developed small, devoted followings, even after being pulled from national distribution, a handful of loyal customers writing in regularly to ask whether a particular favourite might ever return, keeping alive a demand too small to justify renewed national production but genuine nonetheless. Occasionally, the company would respond to these persistent requests with a limited regional re-release, testing whether a product previously deemed a broader failure might still find a smaller sustainable audience. The visual archive of these forgotten products, preserved mostly in old magazine advertisements and company catalogues rather than any surviving physical packaging, offers today's historians a particularly vivid window into the decades' shifting tastes and anxieties, each discontinued item representing a small experiment in understanding exactly what American households wanted from their kitchens at a very specific cultural moment, and exactly where that understanding, however carefully researched, occasionally still fell short. For the home economists and researchers directly responsible for these less successful products, the disappointment of a discontinued item carried its own genuine professional weight, months or sometimes years of careful development work ultimately failing to translate into lasting consumer adoption. And yet this same team continued, product after product, decade after decade, willing to risk this kind of visible, sometimes public failure in service of the occasional genuine success, understanding implicitly that a company unwilling to risk failure entirely would likely never have discovered the small, crucial adjustments, an added egg here, a reworked flavour there, that ultimately produced its most enduring and beloved products. Looking back today at the full catalogue of these forgotten items, side by side with the handful that became genuine household staples, it becomes easier to appreciate just how much quiet trial and error sat beneath the brand's polished, confident public image. For every cheerful advertisement promising a foolproof result, there existed somewhere behind it a discarded formula, a shelved flavour, a quietly abandoned concept that simply never found its footing with the women it was meant to serve. This unseen graveyard of ordinary commercial failure, rarely acknowledged in any official company history, nonetheless shaped the eventual successes just as meaningfully as any single triumphant product launch. Decades later, that same red spoon logo still sits on shelves, largely unchanged, still recognizable, still quietly reassuring. What began as a marketing invention in the 1920s became, by the 1950s, something closer to a member of the family, and in kitchens all across the country in some small way she still is. Walk down a grocery aisle today, and that same familiar red script remains instantly recognizable, carried forward across generations of packaging redesigns that have remarkably preserved the essential warmth of the original identity even as everything surrounding it has changed considerably. What is perhaps most remarkable, looking back across the full span of this history, is how thoroughly a deliberately manufactured character managed to embed itself into genuine lived family memory. Women today, well into their 80s and 90s, still speak of specific recipes learned from that same red cookbook with genuine warmth. The same warmth typically reserved for memories of an actual person rather than a corporate creation. Their daughters and granddaughters, inheriting these same cookbooks, these same handwritten margin notes, carry that warmth forward into kitchens the original creators of the character could scarcely have imagined. The essential formula that made this possible was never particularly complicated, though it required consistent, careful attention across decades to maintain properly. Offer genuine help without diminishing pride. Speak with patience rather than condescension. Listen carefully to real concerns, however minor they might initially seem, and adjust accordingly rather than assuming the company already knew best. Above all, remain consistently, reliably present, decade after decade, through changing kitchens and changing expectations and changing definitions of what American domestic life actually looked like. There is something worth honouring in this particular kind of quiet, sustained care, even recognising its commercial origins honestly. It would have been considerably easier, and likely still profitable, to treat the character as a simple marketing tool, updated periodically for trend and profit alone. Instead, generations of employees clearly took genuine care in maintaining something that had, almost accidentally, become meaningful to millions of actual women navigating the very real, very demanding work of running a household. And so, as this particular story comes to its quiet close, it feels worth pausing simply to appreciate the strange, gentle magic of it all. A name selected in a boardroom, a signature drafted by a secretary, a face redrawn 8 times to keep pace with changing decades. And somehow, from all of this careful, deliberate construction, something genuinely warm emerged, something that filled real kitchens with real comfort during real, ordinary afternoons, one cake, one casserole, one quiet Tuesday at a time. Looking back across the entire arc of this history, from that first careful boardroom discussion about a name and a signature, through the radio broadcasts and the letters and the television appearances, through the failed products and the beloved ones, through the classrooms and the coffee clatches and the recipe boxes passed quietly, from mother to daughter, a single thread runs consistently through all of it. A genuine, patient attentiveness to what real women actually needed, rather than what a company simply assumed they should want. This attentiveness required something that many brands then and now struggle to sustain across such a long span of time, a genuine willingness to keep listening even after initial success might have tempted a company toward complacency. Each decade brought its own new challenges, changing kitchen technology, changing family structures, changing expectations about what a woman's role in the household should even look like. And at each turn, the character required careful, thoughtful adjustment rather than a simple, unchanged repetition of whatever had worked in the past. For the many home economists, artists, copywriters, and researchers who contributed to this character across so many decades, most of them working entirely anonymously, their individual names never appearing anywhere near the trusted signature they helped maintain, there is something worth acknowledging in their collective, quiet achievement. They built and sustained, through careful, patient work rarely celebrated publicly, something that countless women genuinely came to rely upon, not merely as a source of recipes, but as a steady, dependable presence. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of this entire story, not the specific recipes themselves, many of which have long since been replaced by newer, more convenient alternatives, but the underlying principle those recipes always represented, that genuine care, offered patiently and consistently, without judgment, without condescension, and without ever suggesting that a woman's own effort and skill had become unnecessary, could build a kind of trust durable enough to last not just years but entire generations, passed forward quietly through stained cookbook pages and half-remembered kitchen table conversations, long after the specific marketing strategy that first created it had faded from anyone's immediate memory. It is worth sitting, one final time, with the sheer improbability of it all. A cake mix company, decades ago, set out simply to sell a convenient product to busy households, and in doing so, almost by accident, built something that outlasted nearly every other cultural artifact of its specific era. Still recognizable, still trusted, still quietly present in kitchens belonging to women who were not yet born when that first, careful boardroom meeting took place. Few marketing decisions from any decade manage this particular kind of longevity, and fewer still manage it while remaining, at their core, genuinely gentle, genuinely patient, and genuinely concerned with making an ordinary woman's demanding, unglamorous day just slightly easier to carry. So as the kitchen finally grows quiet, and the last of that warm, sweet smell settles into the walls, let's sit for a moment with everything we walked through today. A woman who was never real, and yet somehow felt more dependable than most people you've known. A cookbook stained soft with butter and years. A radio voice arriving at the same hour every week, faithful as a friend who never once forgot to call. Think about the actual hands behind all of it. The ones who measured flour a little too generously because that's how their own mother did it. The ones who cracked an egg into a bowl on a Tuesday afternoon for no reason other than that a child would be walking through the door soon, hungry and tired and needing something warm. They were not trying to be remembered. They were simply trying to get through the day and to make it a little softer for the people they loved. There is a kind of grace in that, in choosing quietly and without applause to show up the same way tomorrow as you did today. So tonight, maybe you carry forward something small, a slower morning, a recipe made from scratch, just once, just to feel your own hands in it, or simply a moment tomorrow where you notice the smell of something baking and let yourself stay in it a little longer than you need to. History is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a red spoon on a cardboard box, and a mother's handwriting in the margin of a cookbook, and a cake rising slowly behind a warm oven door. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Rest well tonight. You're safe. You are warm, and somewhere still, a kitchen is quietly filling with sweetness.